when people are too engaged, when the hands are always up, when they're always trying to interrupt? What do we do in that scenario? And I specifically want to focus on interruptions because I think they are the most daunting thing. When someone interrupts your presentation, how do you deal with that? And I believe you've got three options when that happens. Option number one is to ignore. Is to ignore the interruption and carry on with your presentation. Now, what do you think would be the positive of ignoring an interruption? What would be the positive of ignoring an interruption? Isabel, go ahead.
Means you can just keep going.
It does, doesn't it? It means you can just carry on. You don't have to think about time. You don't have to get yourself off track. You can just carry on, which is brilliant. But what is the downside to ignoring? What would you say is the downside? Chris, go ahead.
I've got kids, so I know if you ignore them, it only gets worse.
Sometimes the problem will increase, but also if that person has interrupted and they have a good point and you ignore that, the rest of the audience might think that you're not confident enough to address that point. So you can lose a little bit of credibility here. What I would say with ignoring interruptions, it highly depends on the size of the audience. If you're speaking in front of 100 people or more, then it's easy to ignore a heckle. You see this all the time in comedy shows. But when it's an intimate audience of 3 people, 5 people, 30 people, very difficult to just ignore something and carry on. Which brings us to our second option, address. Address the interruption head on. Now, what do you think is the key benefit of addressing the interruption? Any ideas? Abraham, please.
It tells them that you've heard them. So it stops them continuing, as somebody said already, that you can't just ignore things, it will continue.
Yeah, it's almost we're like acknowledging them, like we spoke about with the angry audience. We're acknowledging that interruption. Claire, did you have a similar point or a different point?
My different point is it puts you back in control.
Right. Puts you back in. Expand on that a little bit if you wouldn't mind.
Well, if you have someone who keeps interrupting, then other people will start paying attention who are next to the room to that person rather than you speaking. So if you actually then address them, you're almost pulling back all their attention from everyone else.
Love that. Love that. Absolutely. That's 100% right. What I would also say is that it could, by addressing the interruption, it could be a good teaching opportunity. Maybe you have a good answer for that interruption, or maybe you have a way of adding more knowledge on the back of that interruption. So it could be a good opportunity to teach. The downside, however, is interruptions can go way off track. You can spend 5 minutes trying to deal with an interruption, then you don't know where you were going, and you've ended up somewhere you did not want to be, and you're worried about the time. So that is the downside. But there is a third option that we can do here. We can redirect an interruption. Okay, this is when someone interrupts you and you said, hold up, I love that question, but let me answer it at the end. That's essentially what you're looking to do here. You're redirecting them to a different place. Again, what do you think is the key advantage of that? Nigel, go ahead.
Yeah, you don't lose your flow and continuity in what you're doing.
Kind of got the best of both worlds here, right? We're acknowledging that interruption. So we're taking back the attention, like Claire said, but at the same time, we're not worried about the time. We're not going off into Pluto, are we? Right? So we're retaining our control, we're retaining our direction. The downside, however, is when you come to the end of the presentation and you're doing your questions, it can be really easy to forget that interruption that took place. It can be really easy to forget it. And then sometimes that interruption is not answered at the end. So you have to be careful of that, especially if you get a lot of different questions. The key thing to do, though, is to decide in advance. If you think you're going to go into a difficult audience who are going to interrupt you, who are going to be a bit boisterous, think about what you will do. Are you just going to ignore them? Are you going to address them head on? Or are you going to redirect them? Or are you going to be a little bit flowing and just see which one comes up in the situation? But the key thing is to know what your next step will be, then you can handle that interruption successfully.